Half the kids I knew had the same deal. Nobody home after school. You came in, dropped your backpack, turned the TV on just to get some noise going, because the quiet in an empty house has a specific weight to it when you're 8 years old. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And what I didn't figure out until much later is that those afternoons alone didn't just fill the time, they actually changed something in me. Made me into a person who never ever asks for help. And I'm only now starting to figure out what it cost us. So before we get into it, a quick transparency note. I'm not a psychologist. What I do have is an undergrad degree in psychology from the University of Washington and a lifelong interest in the subject. But I'm not coming at this from a clinical background. I'm coming at it as someone who grew up in the middle of all this and eventually started connecting the dots. Let me give you some context because I think it matters. By the mid-1980s, divorce rates in the United States had roughly doubled compared to the 1950s. And by 1985, more than half of all mothers with school-aged children were working full-time. Those two things happening simultaneously created something that hadn't existed at scale before. Kids coming home to empty houses every single day as a completely normal part of childhood. The latchkey kid was a real thing, not some media invention. Now it's painted as Gen X kids wearing a house key on a string around their neck every day, but that's not really the situation. Kids either carried keys in their pocket or the houses weren't even locked. I grew up in a community where we didn't even lock the front door until my later high school years. I think after a while we locked the front door, but then we kept the door in our garage cracked open and you could enter the house through the garage. But the idea was kids had keys to their house because nobody was home. So as a Gen X kid, you came home, you let yourself in, figured out whatever needed figuring out. Nobody called to check in on you because there was really no way to do that. And honestly, in most cases, it probably didn't even occur to anyone that it was necessary. You were just trusted with everything. So what did those afternoons look like? You made your own food, watched whatever happened to be on, did your homework, or you didn't do your homework because nobody was really checking. If something broke, you dealt with it, and if you got hurt somewhere along the way, you found a Band-Aid and kept going. There was genuinely no one to ask, and there was no Google or anything like that. A 2024 study out of the University of North Carolina found that modern children are supervised roughly 90% of their waking hours. For Gen X kids in the late 70s and early 80s, estimates put that closer to 40%. So when people say that the Gen X childhood was different, the numbers actually back that up. And here's something that might surprise you. Researchers found that it wasn't the kids from struggling families who spent the most time alone. It was actually children from higher-income suburban households. Parents in neighborhoods they considered safe were more likely to let their kids come home to an empty house. So here's what all those afternoons actually built. Every time you solved a problem alone as a kid, figured out dinner, handled something that went wrong, navigated whatever came up without any help, your brain logged it. It thought, I can handle this. Psychologists call this self-efficiency, which is basically just the belief that you're capable of handling whatever comes at you. Gen X developed this in a significant way, and that part is well documented and real. But there's a side of this that doesn't get much attention. That same process that built the competence also built something else alongside it. A deeply held sense that needing help is a form of weakness, then asking for it means you couldn't manage it on your own. Because for years, across an entire childhood, there legitimately was no one to ask. So eventually you stopped. And after a while, you stopped even noticing that you could. It shows up in adult life in a pretty specific way. You take on everything alone until you're completely overwhelmed, and then you handle it some more. Handing things off to other people is genuinely hard, not because you're controlling, but because some part of your nervous system doesn't quite trust that anyone will actually follow through. And rest feels like something you haven't quite earned yet. Everyone in your life comes to you when they need something, but you're hard-pressed to remember the last time that situation ran the other way. Therapists who work with Gen X adults keep hearing one phrase come up over and over again. I don't want to burden anyone with my problems. It's worth thinking about where that sentence comes from. It's the latchkey afternoon kid showing up in adult form. The understanding, built over years of an entire childhood, that your problems are yours alone to deal with. That understanding didn't evaporate when you grew up, it just kind of faded into the background. And just a personal story, I've experienced this firsthand, this reluctance to ask for help as an adult. I had some back taxes, and it was an issue I didn't know if I was going to be able to get out of. So if I paid the back taxes back, I wouldn't afford rent. I thought I was going to either be homeless or have my account seized by the IRS. I mean, what do you do at that point? My dad was going through cancer treatments. He had just recovered, so he actually needed help around his home. So I moved in with him and helped him around his house for his last few years of life. And it turned into a win-win because we got to spend more time together. And I caught up in taxes and got to spend time with my dad. And I miss him dearly. He passed away this last summer. And the reason why I'm making this video is I know as Gen X, we kind of have a hard outer shell. We're pretty badass. We're proud of it. But if you need help, just ask for it. People like helping. By asking for a favor, you're actually doing a good thing. I know it sounds crazy. I had to rewire my whole brain around this. But I hope this gets through to the people who are struggling. Now, why is this a Gen X specific thing? Like, why not millennials and boomers? Well, baby boomers grew up in the 1950s and early 60s when stay-at-home mothers were the norm and neighborhoods functioned as actual communities. People genuinely kept an eye on each other's kids, and that structure was real. Gen X was the first generation to come of age after it had largely fallen apart. Millennials had a completely different experience. By the time they were kids in the 80s and 90s, the pendulum had started to swing hard the other direction. Helicopter parenting showed up specifically as a response to the Gen X childhood. Gen X parents had been left to fend for themselves as kids and weren't interested in passing that on. And here's another interesting piece of trivia. Gen X currently owns approximately 47% of all small businesses in the United States, more than any other generation, including millennials, who are far larger in total population. The generation that figured everything out alone as kids grew up to be the generation that builds things on their own as adults. That's not a coincidence. As a Gen Xer, that makes me proud. We're pretty cool. And that resilience and adaptability Gen X built, it's real. It shows up in the research, and it shows up in how people actually move throughout their lives, and I'm not disputing any of it. But something did get traded away in the process. What got traded is the ability to let people in, to admit when you're running on empty, and to actually say to someone you trust that you could use some help. A lot of Gen X adults have spent years managing alone without ever quite naming how isolating that gets. Researchers who study Gen X and mental health keep landing on a term: functional loneliness, which means you're surrounded by people, you're managing things, and everything looks fine from the outside, but there's a quiet underneath it that's been there for a long time. And it's not all that different from the quiet of that empty house after school when you were a kid. None of this is about undoing what got built. What's worth recognizing is that you built it under a specific set of conditions that don't actually apply anymore. A kid alone in a house who genuinely needed to be able to handle it. You're not that kid anymore, and you're allowed to ask for help. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, think about the last time you asked someone for help with something that actually mattered. Going to a person you trust, telling them you could use a hand. When was the last time that happened? For a lot of us, it's been a while. Your childhood makes a bigger impact than what you think, and that's what that Gen X childhood put in us. All those afternoons when you were the only one there and you figured it out anyway, over and over, until handling it alone was just how things worked. You figured it out then, you're still figuring it out, but you don't have to keep doing it alone.